So when you say communists, what do you mean by that? What does the word communist mean to you? Out of curiosity. Just curious. Said some people turn off their brains and never turn them back on. That's true. That's true. But I'm going to put RuneScape up here. And I just want to know what communist means to you. Ah, see that communism is an economic theory. Okay, that is a statement. Doesn't mean much, but it's a statement. That also had a philosophical theory. Again, that's a statement. It's not much of a statement. Called historical materialism. Okay, cool. That's not a definition of what communism is. That's just saying it's labeled this. What it's labeled is not something I give a shit about, and it took you a while to respond to that, so I'm assuming you Googled that. There's nothing wrong with Googling for your answers, by the way. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Doing more research is a good thing. So you could say that about capitalism? What can you say about capitalism? I didn't Google, come on. It just took you a very long time to respond, so I assumed that that's what was happening. I could be wrong, but again, there's nothing wrong with Googling for the answers. This isn't a test. This is simply me asking a question. Said Hayek, Rothbard theories. That doesn't tell you what a thing is. How would one recognize what a communist government is? What would be the aspects of a government that you would use to say this is a communist economic system or this is a communist government? What would you look for? Super Logo says the state before the individual. Okay, so you've just described nationalism. You've described nationalism, you've described fascism, you've described authoritarianism. You haven't described communism. Super Logo says, nope, you can say that. I said, that is in capitalist books. Okay. That doesn't tell me anything. Sarah Jagrita says, communist government divided by zero can't happen. Alright. So, we're going to use Wikipedia. We're going to use Wikipedia real quick. Wikipedia is not a source, but you can look at the sources for anything on Wikipedia if you disagree with what I'm showing you here. In Marxist thought, a communist society, or the communist system, is the type of society and economic system postulated to emerge from technological advances in the productive forces representing the ultimate goal of the political ideology of communism. A communist society is characterized by common ownership of the means of production with free access to the articles of consumption. It is stated to be a classless, stateless, moneyless society, which would imply the end of the exploitation of labor. Hayek wrote a book studying the Nazis. Hitler was a socialist. Hitler wasn't a socialist, though. Hitler used socialist ideas because those ideas were popular, but he was not a socialist. So if communism is a stateless, classless, it said, yeah, but the economic system, Super Loco, what is socialism? Because now we've moved from what communism is. Because if you accept that communism is a classless, stateless, moneyless society, then communism currently has no victims. Because communism, as an economic concept, has not emerged yet. Because in Marxist theory, a communist society comes about when technology has gotten to the point where scarcity has been completely eliminated. We do not live in that world yet. Therefore, communism hasn't happened yet. It's a utopian end goal. Super Loco says that's the theory of communism. Capitalism is also a stateless system. No, it's not. Capitalism is a system where capital can be owned by individuals. That is what makes capitalism capitalism. It exists within states perfectly fine. Has nothing to do with being a state at all. Jim Anon points out that Hitler was not a socialist. He pretended to be one and had all the socialists in his parties murdered. Yeah, that was the Night of Long Knives. For example, using Hayek, the U.S. is not capitalism. So the U.S. is a capitalist country. 100% it is. It is not pure free market capitalism, but it is capitalism. Definitionally. Said you have central banks, and having a bank does not mean that your society is not capitalist at all. That is not a aspect of whether something is or is not capitalist. I have a feeling you don't actually know what the fuck you're talking about. When you say that banks exist, therefore you don't have capitalism, I'm sorry, I feel like you don't have brain cells. I think that's the take that I'm getting here. Capitalism is an economic system where individuals, as opposed to the proletariat, can own capital. That is what makes it capitalism. It's not me, it's Hayek, but you're the one quoting them. You're the one saying that. I'm not arguing with Hayek. I'm not arguing with a long since dead political philosopher. I'm arguing with you. I don't give a fuck what he said. I give a fuck what you say. Again, I don't give a shit what Hayek says. People who are philosophers can get shit wrong. For instance, did you know that Marx got a bunch of shit wrong when he wrote his political philosophies? And in fact, if you want to hear of another political philosopher who agreed largely with a lot of things Marx said, but also points out a ton of areas where he got shit wrong and his focus is on the revolution, then maybe read Conquest of Bread. Kropotkin had a lot of criticisms of Marx. Superlogo says the US isn't capitalism because you have the Fed creating money to destroy price discovery. All right. So capitalism is any country, any economic or political system where a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit. Guess what we have in the United States? Superlogo says, funny thing is the first thing socialist and communist countries did is creating central banks. Where is a socialist country? Can you find me a socialist country on a map? Can you find me actually, you know what? Can you find me a communist country on a map? Right now. Because again, we got to go back to the definition of communism. If communism is a stateless, classless, moneyless society, then we don't have any of those. Anselin says the goalposts around have more moves than Jagger. Bernie says, I feel like I'm watching a cat chase its tail, but less cute. You're being extreme. Economic theories is utopia. Extreme communist capitalism are ideas. I'm not being extreme. I'm saying exactly what these things are called. It's not extreme to say capitalism is a system where a country's trade and industry are controlled by private individuals. That's not extreme. That's just what it is. It's not extreme to say that communism is a stateless, classless, moneyless society, because that's what it is. That's how you would identify a communist society. If it lacks a state, if it lacks a currency, mostly if it lacks scarcity, that's what makes a society communist. That's what makes a government or an economic system communist. If you don't have those things, you don't have communism. Actually, after the Great Depression, we lived in a system called Keynesian. Okay, did you know that Keynesian economics are capitalist economics? So there isn't true capitalism either. Keynesian economics is a form of capitalism, my guy. Keynesian economics operates within a system of private ownership and market competition. It is a modification on capitalism. It is, in and of itself, capitalist. Every Austrian theory hates Keynes. I don't give a shit. You just said that Keynesian economics aren't capitalism, but they are by definition. I don't think you know what you're talking about. Said it's not. You can say it's not, but again, the definition of a capitalist society is one where private interests control capital. That's what makes something capitalist. Keynesian economics is capitalistic. Ninja says at least he's living up to his moniker. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting here. Cyberchill says, so basically you think that there's no capitalism unless... did you read Hayek? That isn't the definition. I don't give a fuck what Hayek said. I don't. This isn't a stream where we do the dumb shit of, you haven't read enough political philosophy. I don't have to do that. That's not a thing that I need to do. Because multiple political philosophers disagree with one another. So why the fuck should I specifically read any one of them, if not to see specifically the disagreements? So anarcho-capitalism is kind of the extreme, much like communism. Again, communism hasn't happened. We don't have a communist economic system in any country. It hasn't happened. And as far as I'm concerned, it's never gonna happen, because I don't see us getting rid of scarcity in such a way that would cause that to happen. Cal says, hey, Sarah, I just did a fan art. I'll take a look at it here in a minute. So you refuse to accept definitions that are broad, and then you say that my definitions that you also disagree with are too specific. Said because communism can't work, as Marx said. Sure, you and I both agree on that. You and I both agree communism's not happening. Who cares? Not my point. If the original conversation was that communism had a higher death toll than the Nazi Party, and the definition of communism is a country that has never existed, then your argument must be that a country that has never existed has engaged in violent war crimes and killed 100,000 people or 100 million people. Now, as it turns out, I know where you got that number from. That number is from the Big Book of Communism. The editor of the Big Book of Communism, Stephanie Cordes, was actually accused by their co-authors in the book for arbitrarily inflating all of their figures to reach a round number of 100 million because that number would spark conversation. The book used indirect deaths and even used the deaths of future potential people to inflate the numbers to get to 100 million. And again, even if we accept all those figures as accurate, we still don't have communism causing them, because we don't have any countries that have actually been communist. Then we can use the argument people that used communism, real or not real, killed more people than the Nazis. That's a different statement, though. That is a different statement. But like how Hitler used the word socialism to get people on board with the Nazi Party, and then did not actually engage in socialism in Weimar Germany, then the argument is people used a largely popular concept to get people on board with genocides. Now suddenly you and I agree. Suddenly you and I agree that that is a thing that nations do. The USSR and Russia, by extension currently, were shit. You and I agree on that. China is shit. It engages in a fuck ton of human rights violations against its own citizens. You and I seem to be on the same goddamn side. But semantics causes you to not be, which is wild to me. Once the statement changes to people who use the word communist are responsible for a lot of deaths, suddenly you and I are on the same page. China, which uses the economic theory of state capitalism, uses the word communist to describe its primary political party and engages in human rights violations and genocides like they did against the Uyghurs. Cool. Now you agree. You and I agree on the same fucking thing now. Isn't that wild? All it took was a semantic shift, and suddenly we're on the exact same page. The lesson to take from this is to not use bullshit stats from the Big Book of Communism and to be specific with your language. We don't have a communist country, so when somebody calls themselves a communist, they're not wearing the burden of what all the communists before them have done, because we don't have any of those. Moreover, the definition of communism is a stateless, classless, moneyless society. It says I need to translate my thinking to not native. That's also fair. I can understand that perspective. Axo says, the stateless part is what bugs me because that shit's never gonna happen. How so? Axo, the Native Americans didn't have a state. The Native Americans didn't have that. Like, it's going to be interesting what we do when we do space travel. It's going to be very interesting. Ninja says, just wait until you find out what I did as of today. So, I mean, just with how things are right now, maybe eventually, but it would take countries merging, basically. So, like, a state is a sovereign, non-physical political entity with a defined territory, a defined population, and a government. The state and a government are not the same thing. A government is there to serve the state. Now, we could say that a communist government could exist if we eliminate the state part and say that it's a classless, moneyless society. After all, if political philosophers are able to write on communism and have different ideas of what it means, then there's no reason that we can't do the same fucking thing. So if we're going to say a classless, moneyless society, then we've described Star Trek. We've just described Star Trek. That's all it is. A volunteer society without money, generally speaking, depending on which version you're watching, that has eliminated scarcity. That's communism. Star Trek has it. It's very hard to argue they don't have a state. Because the Earth would have borders. Earth as a apparatus has borders. Old Gus says, yep, Russia and China had massive death tolls directly attributed to themselves without inflating, but you don't get a massive death toll everywhere you get people calling themselves communist. Anselin says, but how do we get to that post-scarcity condition? So, in Marxist theory, it's technology that gets us there. Like, that's literally what Marx thought would get us there. Technology would get us to the point where we could eliminate scarcity. You don't have a scarcity of fuel if the fuel can be synthesized at such a great amount that it doesn't have fucking worth anymore. You don't have to worry about food if technology is able to produce food at a rapid rate. And not just agriculturalism. Like, that's a thing that we do already. But there's a reason that in Star Trek, the thing that caused post-scarcity society to exist is the fabricator. Whether or not one of those is possible, don't know. Don't care. I'm not here to say whether or not communism is possible. It certainly isn't possible within my lifetime as far as I know. Dirtbus says, borders are the most intangible things. The state uses its power to remind you it even exists. Basically. Cybershield says, Starfleet's the closest thing to communism, and that's really only because the replicator can pretty much make anything besides rarities like dilithium. And the only reason it can't make a rarity like dilithium is literally plot convenience. That's the reason why. Like the replicator, the fabricator, whatever you want to call it, the reason that it can't produce certain things is because the plot demanded it. That's it. That said, that was a fun conversation. Kinda. Sorta. Hey, you made it to the end. I want to give an extra thanks to the patrons who allow me to do this full time. I want to thank Aaron Rail, Astral, Britzkrieg, Jemshin, Poundini, Red Joker, Victoria, Jonas, Craig, Tarika, Fireshard, Smiling GM, John, Dren Hadamada, Creeper, Sagitta, you know I'm not saying that last part, Valis of Sereth, Ottoman Angel, Rooster Rachel, and Fire Panda, who are all my $20 and up patrons.